Metal guys, I'm recording this intro to the video after I read the short story, and I just wanted to make clear that my English is of course not perfect, and sometimes I stumble over my own tongue and stuff like that, but the original text is like so fucked up, it's hard to read it in German, and it's also very repetitive in some kind, so yeah, there's that. It's really bad in the original, and during the end, where Reiner's body probably pulled the blood from his brain and put it somewhere where it could have more fun, yeah, you can really see that and read that, I mean by that, because the sentence doesn't make any sense anymore, and so I kinda had to improvise a bit, and some of the grammar mistakes are also there because they were also in the original, and I kinda tried to translate that also, but yeah, you can never get the full experience, sadly, if you can't read it in German, but I tried my best to give you a glimpse into the understanding of this guy who derives everything he knows about sex from porn and hentai, and yeah. This was one of his earlier stories. It's not that crazy and fucked up like the later stuff, like the 2 books he wrote, which quasi are just one book. He altered the first book, but that's another story. I'm going to make more videos about Reiner, and yeah, this is just a little introduction into content about him that isn't already on YouTube in English. So yeah, enjoy. Sex in the Middle Ages. It is the year 1025. It is the times of witch burnings, the Crusades, and when different stuff was the order of the day. But naturally, sex was also there. In the Middle Ages, sex was something that was practiced way earlier, so children were enlightened on the topic way earlier, since they were sleeping in one room with the adults. That way, children could watch their parents and grandparents have sex. This was totally normal during that period of time. Though my story is not about children, it is about adults. It was cold, and on the outside was raging a storm and lightning all over the sky. But inside the castle the mood was good, because today it was again time for the king and the knights to have a huge binge. This means they would all gather in the big hall, and that it would all turn into a giant orgy. In the big hall the mood was already good. A few of the maidens were already naked and were running, giggling and laughing through the room. A few of the knights were already sitting undressed on their chairs. One knight even had a nude girl sitting on him. He played with her breasts while she was gently moving up and down, and she was moaning slightly and steadily getting louder. The king was also sitting stripped in his throne, while the queen was kneeling before him, facing him and pleasuring him. The king seemed to enjoy that. Meanwhile, even more knights got undressed and were now hunting for one of the girls that was running around. One of them caught one and was holding on tight. She didn't resist, the opposite was happening. She seemed to rejoice, and she was hugging the man and kissing him. The man picked up the woman by her ass and carried her over to a chair. There he sat down and put her on his already hard member, and she moaned full of lust. Meanwhile, the king had already beckoned to 2 maidservants. One of them followed his gesture, and when she reached the king, he grabbed her booty with his left hand, and while he was pulling her towards him, his hand slipped deeper and pushed it directly into her wet vagina. And the queen was sitting on his hard dick. Both women were instantly moaning hornily. While the king was fingering the maiden, her cunt was twitching because of her horniness. While the queen was riding the king, he stood up and kept holding on to her. Then he lay down on the bearskin in front of his throne, and showing with a gesture to the maiden that she should sit on his face so that he can lick her. She was smiling and approached in an instant. It seems that she liked that, and so the king was lying on the bearskin while the queen had his dick in her cunt, and the maiden on his face so that he could lick her. 2 of the knights were seeing this, so they approached so that the maiden and the queen could also have something to suck on. The queen was beckoning to the young servant, who until now was standing in the corner and was looking shyly. He was hesitantly approaching and asking, "Yes, my queen?" The queen said, "Come on and show me what you're hiding." He approached her further and she grabbed him and opened his pants. The boy was still very young. Then she said, "My king, am I allowed to withdraw with this boy?" The king said, "Of course, my queen." The queen beckoned to a maiden. It came and asked, "Yes, my queen, what may I do for you?" The queen said, "Make the king happy on this evening." Then she took the servant by the hand and went with him into a room. There she laid down on a bed and beckoned to the servant. Then she said, "Undress yourself," and the boy did as he was told. Then the queen said, "Well, okay, get over here." The boy seemed to be nervous, but the queen said, "Don't worry, my boy." And so she went with him to the bedchamber. As they arrived, they headed for the bed. The young servant asked himself, what will happen now? He looked at the queen and she was already naked. She was a gorgeous woman. She had a beautiful shaped breast and a well-shaped pelvis. She had dark red hair and was a little taller than him. No wonder, he was only 17 years old. He blushed and looked shyly to the ground, but she said, "It is okay for you to look at me?" He started to look up and saw that she was smiling. She made it clear that he should approach her and ask him how old he was. After a few steps approaching her, he said that he had just turned 17. "Ah," she said, "this means you are just perceived as an adult." "Yes, my lady," said the young boy shyly and looked downwards again. He was hesitating and then asked, "Is it really okay?" She said, "Normally not, but today is an exception." The king agreed and he has his own servants for tonight. "It's an exception that we sometimes need." The boy seemed relieved. The queen said, "Am I the first naked woman you saw?" The boy blushed and said, "The first from this distance." "Well, then I will be the first you are allowed to touch." He came closer and obeyed. Then she said, "Undress yourself." Hesitantly he took off his shirt and trousers. As he was standing in front of her, in only his underwear, he noticed how aroused he was, and his arousal was clearly visible due to the bulge in his undies. "Now lay down next to me." He did as he was told. Now the queen was gently caressing his belly while her hand was heading downwards. Now she gently caressed his bulge, and with the other hand she turned his head towards her. As he was looking at her, she kissed him and went down his undies. Then she said, "Come on, touch me." So he first touched her breast, was kneading it gently. Then he commenced to lick her nipples. Meanwhile, he put his other hand between her thighs and gently caressed her pubic eminence. Now the queen completely removed the boy's undies and laid on top of him in a way so that he got a good view of her lust garden, and she could unhurriedly blow his strong and hard pole. So she took him into her mouth and started playing with the tongue around the tip. The boy moaned and tensed his muscles. Then he played around with his tongue on her pubic eminence, while he pushed fingers into her grotto of lust as well as into her ass. The queen moaned and tensed her muscles just to relax them immediately afterwards. Then she pulled back his foreskin again so that she could play around with the tip of the glans. The boy moaned, "I'm coming." The queen said, "It's okay, you can come." So he came into her face. Thereupon she licked his glans clean and was still sucking a bit on the tip. He moaned and said, "I can go again one more time if you demand so." The queen said, "I hope you can go again more than just one time." The boy said, "If you demand it, I will have two." While she was still sucking a bit, she registered how he was getting harder again, and she turned around and sat down on him. The boy moaned while he was migrated into her. The queen also moaned and started to gently move up and down. During that, the queen put her hands on her breasts and massaged them, while the boy moaned and put his hands on her waist. Slowly, the queen went faster and moaned louder. The boy enjoyed the thrusts and felt how his thrusts were going deeper into her. The queen moaned, "Yes, go deeper." The boy felt how horny the queen was due to his thrusts. Suddenly, she stated, "I'm coming." He felt that he was about to come again, and so she stepped up a tempo and they both had their climax together. He was shocked as he recognized the strength of his erection, and as he came, the queen seemed to overflow. She felt it too, and with her hand she touched her pubic eminence, and she felt how wet she really was. She also felt as he slided outwards that there was still sperm shooting out of him. Then she said, "Wait here, I will be right back." The queen left the room, and a few seconds later she came back with two persons, a beautiful young woman and a young man who also was in the castle. The queen went to the bed again and laid down next to the boy. Then she said to the both who have just arrived, "Get naked." The servants did as they were told. As they were fully unclothed, she said, "Well, get over here and keep us company." The young servant came over without hesitation, but the young maiden hesitated, but then she came over. Of the both of them, he seemed to be the older one, still the maiden was the youngest one. Then the queen said, "First of all, tell me your names." The boy said, "I'm called Duncan." The girl said hesitantly, "I'm called Hannah." The boy said with a raspy voice, "My name is Rainer." The queen said, "Now that we know each other, let us have some fun." Now the queen said, "Hannah, I want you to suck off Rainer." Hannah seemed to be insecure, but she did as the queen was demanding. Then the queen said to Duncan, "I want you to push your spear into Hannah." Duncan looked at the young woman. She then looked up in terror. Then he did as he was ordered. The queen was now watching as Hannah was blowing Rainer, as Duncan was pushing his spear into this young, rarely touched woman. As he was intruding into her, she moaned and seemed to have forgotten that she was supposed to blow the boy. But shortly after she remembered and took up the work again. Meanwhile, the queen watched the ambush and started to caress herself. Suddenly, she noticed how the young Rainer was examining her and that he was beckoning her. The queen thought to herself, "Yes, now it's going to really get horny." She followed the request and sat down on his face so that he could lick her with comfort. Now Duncan said to Hannah, "Why don't you lay down next to Rainer?" She followed the request and laid down next to him. Then Duncan laid down in a way so that he could lick her, but she could still blow him. The queen took notice that something has changed, laid down next to Rainer and said, "Go on, fuck me." He lay down on top of her and thrust it into her the second time. She moaned and seemed to enjoy it. Rainer looked down next to him and saw that Duncan and Hannah were having their climax together. Hannah was moaning and clutching with her hand at the bed stuff. As she came, she was that much aroused that she herself was squirting. Duncan came at the same time and jizzed directly into her face. Hannah seemed to enjoy that very much, since she was rubbing her pubic eminence while the other hand pulled back the foreskin of Duncan's penis and she cleaned his glands with her tongue. Duncan moaned and seemed to enjoy it. Now Rainer was focused on the queen again, who also had watched the lustful embers. Now he thrusted deeper and moaned meanwhile. The queen said to Duncan, "I want you to bump Rainer from behind." Rainer looked up and wanted to say something, but then he remembered it was the queen that was demanding it. And so he said nothing. Suddenly he felt a gentle pain from behind. The queen beckoned Hannah and made it clear to her that she should sit down on her face. After she did this, the queen started to lick her. Hannah started to moan as the queen licked her. Rainer started to kiss her, and with his hands he played with her beautiful big breasts. Now Rainer felt how his lumbar started to throb, and he was soon about to come. He felt that Duncan was about ready soon, so he increased his tempo. The queen started to moan fiercely, and now Rainer jizzed directly into her, and he felt how his juices were flowing out of her because it was so much that she just couldn't contain it. At the same time he realized how Duncan jizzed into him, and he recognized that it felt weirdly warm. Now also the queen came while fiercely moaning and started to caress her clit with one hand while the other one played around with Hannah, who also had a climax at the same time. Rainer turned around and looked around the room, and suddenly he recognized the king, who was standing in the doorframe, completely naked, and in one hand he was holding his manhood, which was erected to its full extent. Behind him were standing two maidens that were also touching each other, and everyone was looking over to the bed in which the horny embers took place. Rainer was about to bow down, but the king said, "It's all right, boy. Today this won't be necessary. This was quite an arousing sight to me. Would you mind if I join?" Rainer looked behind him towards the bed and said, "Of course not, since it's your chamber." The king nodded and said, "Well, all right." And he entered, followed by the two girls, of which one wanted to close the door, but the king said, "Just leave it open. Maybe one or another wants to join in." She giggled and came over to the bed. The queen, still aroused, made room for her spouse on the bed, and Rainer sensed that his member was touched, looked down on himself and saw that both maidens were polishing his sword. One of them started to lick his balls and suck on them, while the other one voraciously sucked his dick. He looked at the door and became aware of the fact that two knights were standing there. he beckoned them in. He turned around and saw that the king was thrusting inside the queen, who became aware of his stare, so he beckoned him, and then he asked, "Do you want the front or the back?" Rainer looked at him and said, "I'll do as you please." And the king smiled and pulled his cock out of the queen, who whimpered because she couldn't feel him anymore. Then the king bowed down to Rainer and whispered in his ear, "I will lay down now and position the queen that way, so you can enter her cunt, but me too. Do you understand?" Rainer was startled and said, "Is it all right with you, since then you will feel me too, right?" The king nodded. "This is the horny part about it. In the beginning it will be strange, but believe me, you will enjoy it." So he repeated, "Just to make that clear, you want me to enter her cunt, and you want me to thrust into the same hole as you?" The king nodded. Meanwhile, Rainer was thinking to himself if all of this would affect his position here. So he looked at the king and questioned him about the matter. He replied, "If your performance pleases us, then you will share the bed more often with us." Rainer nodded. "I think I can live with that." The king laid down and made it clear to the queen for her to sit down. Then he penetrated her deep and was nodding to Rainer. Rainer kneeled down with spreaded legs above those of the king and was looking out for the right way to position himself, so that he could enter the same hole as the king. The king was holding the queen in a still way, and Rainer was pushing himself against the queen's back. And he commenced to enter the cunt of the queen, and so joining the king. The queen moaned, and so was Rainer, and also the king gave away an erected moaning. While Rainer was penetrating, the king was pulling his cock out, so Rainer could enter easier. Now they both were entering her together, and the tips of their cocks were meeting each other exactly in the middle of the queen, who was moaning and demanding that they penetrate deeper. So Rainer and the king started to bump her alternatingly, which was a kick-ass feeling for all three of them. Suddenly Rainer recognized a knight sitting down in front of him and entering the queen. Now she was bumped by two in the lascivious pussy and into the ass. She moaned and got wetter. They increased their tempo and started the climax none of the four would ever have thought of to be possible. Yeah, that's it. There comes nothing afterwards. It just ends, and yeah, I'm finished with this piece of art.